but no one's gonna buy that shit.
All
No
right,
one's
we're
gonna spend
recording.
$5. All right, all right.
So what's your pitch for Divinia?
Vinia, world's only pure, balanced, oxygenated, light cellular water.
Okay, sponsor
Um,
us.
it's approved by Gerald Pollack, a physics professor at, is it Cambridge? I don't even know. I don't know which major university he's a professor at, but he's a good name. His name holds water. He has authority, right? He's
Okay.
he's a
You're
physicist, and he
you're really
likes the water. It's really good.
you're really wacky. You're kooky.
I'm kooky.
You're wacky and kooky. Okay, let's start. Okay.
Yeah.
So what are we doing? I think we're introducing our philosophy, but so it's never really been done before, I guess. Well, what I think we're doing is we're going to be writing this book intermittently, in the sense that I'm going to write something and then you're going to write something. We're both going to like play off of each other's writings, and then we kind of record ourselves breaking down what we've written and then expanding on it a little bit more to try to work the text. So essentially this is the first time, maybe, who knows, maybe someone's done it before, that someone will have access to the writing process of a book
Right.
that's been written in tandem with someone else.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool.
And actually, that's more common than most people think. It's it's often a feedback kind of process. A lot of people do that, but then only one person gets the credit, and this way, that's impossible.
we're already talking
This is
about
my
rights.
insurance.
You're gonna be paid 50%. I'm gonna be paid 50%. All right, cool. It's on video. It's on video.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll still make a contract, because I just got burned. For anybody who wants to know, I'm in Deutschland right now, and I was working for some prick down in Bavaria, and the guy does not want to pay me. So anyway.
Oh shit! I didn't know. You didn't tell me that.
Yeah, I know. Huh? What would you? But anyway, it's not a big deal.
Lame, dude.
The point is, I've learned, always write down and sign the contract.
Lame. Yeah, yeah. Even with friends.
Friends, absolutely. There's no friends in business. So, ultimately, this book is about the philosophy that you and I have been creating for the last 2 years now. For anybody who wants to know that. Now, can you still see me if I? So I'm just going to another page here to be able to read the first paragraphs.
Are you on the other page? Because I can see you.
You can see me? Okay, cool. So it's still recording. All right. So Oliver here has written the foreword to the book. It's untitled at the moment, but...
Chapter -2.
Chapter what?
-2.
-2. Okay. Chapter -2. Interesting. So this foreword is... I'm trying to introduce the foreword instead of just talking or reading it, because we're going to go paragraph by paragraph. This is how it's going to work. I'm going to read a paragraph, and then we're going to expand on what's within it, and then we're going to go on to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So this foreword is, in essence, an introduction to the philosophy that we've been creating, which is, in a word or in a phrase, which you gave to me the other day, it's the philosophy of what can be known. But we're tying it to a fundamental substrate to all of reality, which is what can't be known, right? So we're distilling everything that can be known, but we're attaching it to the very reality that we experience all the time, is that we don't really know everything. It's paradoxical in nature. And that's why the whole philosophy is called Paradoxism. So this foreword, basically, what Oliver is going to be doing is writing, encompassing the sort of problems or the experience that humans have when it comes to the most existential questions that everybody usually kind of escapes through believing in some dogma without actually thinking about if they believe in it or not, or drugs or whatever. But most people do not think about these big existential questions on a day-to-day basis. And
Well, I would argue that it's still going on in our minds. It's still
it is.
relevant to everyone.
It's always relevant at all times, but it's not like in our awareness consciously at every day. We're not really thinking about, do I think reality is real? Is there a God? What's purpose? What's my meaning in life? I mean, these things we ask ourselves all the time, but we don't tie them to any kind of larger metaphysical structure. We don't say, what's my meaning in life? You know, in terms of why do I exist? It's more of what's my meaning in life? What good can I do in the community, or what career will make me happy, or whatever. And it usually stops there because people are too afraid to think about, what's the purpose of all? I mean, these big questions.
The things that most people concern themselves with day to day are more superficial versions of the questions that we're going to be talking about.
Exactly.
So we're trying to get to the root, like, why are you having these thoughts? What is behind that thought, and what is behind that thought? And we even, to some degree, get into the way the actual brain works too.
Yeah, so this book is very comprehensive, perhaps the most comprehensive topic that you can have, which is to deal with the absurdity of existence, of reality itself, in a sense. So this foreword, fortunately, is a springboard off of which I can launch off the philosophy. What Oliver and I were discussing prior to recording this is that the reason him and I have been able to develop this philosophy is because he's able to encompass how humans feel and think about the problems of reality and everyday life and existence in itself. He's able to articulate the problem very well, and I'm able to articulate a framework within which we can better understand how to navigate reality. So we play off of each other back and forth, and we've been doing this for the last couple of years. And after having convinced Oliver to write, because he's not really a writer, which he should be, we have the beginning to our book, and we've decided to write it this way by also discussing it and making it public. So here's the foreword of everything we've just been talking about. The very first draft, because this, in essence, is how we're going to get to our second draft, is by having discussed it first.
Yeah.
All right. Most of what we do is project upon the unknown as to make it familiar. We assume likely futures and pick and choose and sometimes conjure the details and perspectives within and about our memories to validate whatever state and worldview we have chosen to find relative solace in the present. One might say this is the result of past trauma, and this is a valid consideration. But again, we must consider that what it is that creates trauma and our susceptibility to be imprinted on by certain things. Sorry, I said that wrong. But again, we must consider what it is that creates trauma and our susceptibility to be imprinted on by certain things. Okay, so how can we break that down a little bit more? How can we expand on that?
Well, I mean, we can really take it from how people actually experience right now. So like me talking to the viewer, we can both relate on the simple fact that we don't know what the future is. And when we look at the past, we can, to some degree, feel like, oh, I remember how it's gone, or we can look at history, the recorded history. But even that, it might not be as obvious as with the future, but we are projecting a lot of favoritism about certain aspects of what we remember and certain aspects of what we like, or certain aspects within what we remember. So like sometimes someone will say something and it affects us a certain way, even though it wasn't meant the way we took it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We tend to be susceptible to seeing things a certain way, and unconsciously we have a reticular activating system, which we'll be talking about more. Our brain is selective. It filters a lot of information out. So it picks and chooses based off of what it's kind of programmed through conditioning, through our life, through what we allow to imprint on us.
Yeah, it's almost like
it actually comes through.
Yeah, it's like an experience. It's almost like a sedentary process, right? Of like I'm almost thinking about real sediments, like which is just sand and rocks that forms layers and layers and layers. But the layers, as we keep building experiences, which can be traumatic or imprints, like you said, they build more layers, which are in themselves shaped by the layers underneath, right? Like if there happens to be a major rock, and then sand kind of piles up on top of that rock, well, there will be a bump there. It's almost like the actions that you take today are, you know, in essence, the result of many other things that happened to you in the past. And there's no way to really figure out exactly why we act the way we act. Some things are traumatic enough. It's like, well, if I see, you know, a snake and I'm, you know, extremely scared of it, like I have a phobia type thing of snakes, then maybe there was a trauma that led to that reaction. So,
and then you look back and maybe you just notice all the times that snakes appeared in your life, or things that resemble snakes.
Yeah. But other things aren't so obvious. It's like, well, if someone, you know, made a comment about my artwork, but I didn't really understand it to be a good thing when the person meant it as a good thing, it's like, well, why did I react as if the person was insulting me rather than a compliment? These things are all due to imprints, if you say, like you say.
And on top of that, we have to talk about how in research they've shown that we make up a lot of memories. We reshape a lot of the details in memories, and most of our memories are quite inaccurate.
Yeah, there's an episode about that in there's this new Netflix show called Explained, and they have one series just based on the mind, so the mind explained. And there's an episode about how memory works, and you're absolutely right. Apparently most of our memories, like up to 90% or something like that. Don't quote me on that. Most of our memories are completely constructed in a sense. Like I can remember having met you the first day, which I do. I remember we met on a film set, and I can make up maybe like a shit ton of details that weren't actually real, that didn't actually happen. So anyway, so looking at this paragraph itself, most of what we do is project upon the unknown. So that the unknown in this case is the future. So
future or past.
Huh?
To a degree. Or the past to some degree.
Past. But when we project, we don't project into the past. I think we use our past traumas and the things that we were imprinted with. And because of our past experience, we project it upon the future. Meaning, well, if I had a bad experience with, let's say I'm a white supremacist and I had bad experiences with black people when I was younger, maybe that's why I project into the future that black people will continue bringing me bad experiences, right? Which is maybe one of the reasons why people hate each other on the planet, because of race and stuff like that.
And individual experiences. Exactly,
individual experiences. So that's what you're saying. And then chosen to find solace in the present. One might say this is the result of past trauma. Yeah. So I think it's a clean, a clean paragraph. The second one is everything from our likelihood of success in all things, what happens after death, the existence or non-existence of some kind of divine or objective exterior moral ideal or being, God in a word, I would say. I am not suggesting any specific view or projection I feel is best, despite the fact that I must acknowledge my unavoidable and constantly fluctuating biases, but instead an approach that takes the consideration of this fact, this habit we have of unconsciously assuming from our emotional narrative more than our intellectual capacity, whose focus is most often an offshoot of one's emotional leaning anyways, and coming to an understanding of how best to navigate with this awareness. But that one was a very well-written paragraph, but again, kind of complex.
It's a bit of a run-on sentence.
Yes, it's dense, and so we should pick that one apart so that people understand it a little bit more.
Yeah. Well,
are you also reading
it? I know. I just had a thought, but I forgot it for a second. What are your initial thoughts? So it'll come back.
Yeah, I think. So you're not suggesting any kind of subjective point of view or claiming any objective sort of power that exists, because you're acknowledging that you're biased and these biases are completely fluctuating at all times. So what you're doing is taking an approach to consider that very fact, which is an important thing. And then it says that generally we have a habit of assuming from our emotional narrative rather than, using our intellectual capacity. And that,
well, I think that
furthermore, hold on.
Yeah.
And that furthermore, the intellectual capacity is itself an offshoot of your emotional imprints that we were talking about earlier anyways.
Yeah.
And so coming to an understanding of how best to navigate your awareness and how you interact with things and people in reality is inherently a problem. That's really what this is saying, I think.
Yeah. Well, an example, like if we're trying to be objective, if we're trying to be intellectual and we're observing the outside world, we're observing phenomena and recording it based off of certain criteria, but we have already behind our awareness, our ability to be aware, a selective process that makes us notice certain patterns, certain types of details, then what's going to be accentuated by our observation is actually just, in a sense, a validation of what we're already subconsciously programmed to see on an emotional level. Like the example I like to give a lot is, unfortunately, Nazi Germany. Like,
you had to use that.
I'm sorry, but it's such a powerful example of this, because they were such they created technologies so quickly, so productively, that were unlike anywhere else in the world. The Panzer tanks, everything. And so then you look at this extremely scientifically advanced group, but then their entire motivation is based, if you actually look at it, on this mystic worldview that Madame Blavatsky prophesized, which involved a hierarchy of races and basically eugenics. So an entire generation of scientists were appealing to a narrative, an emotional, almost like literary narrative, a mystical, esoteric narrative, without even realizing it, because it was cultural. And it became imprinted on how they saw their sciences. They thought that eugenics was validated by science.
Yeah.
And if you only looked at the information that they ended up observing, it makes sense, but in a fucked up way. But you can easily see, from coming from a different culture, a different emotional background, how their focus was limited.
Yeah, and here's where we can start tying it to the philosophy, because what they followed, like system of morality, was evolutionary humanism, which is basically a fancy way of saying, if it exists in nature, it must be moral. So the idea
that's the intellectual aspect that they observed because of an emotional narrative that predisposed them to noticing that specifically. Sorry.
Exactly. So, like, if the lion is the king of the jungle, or the top of the food chain in the natural world, then there's nothing bad about the lion eating a gazelle, and eating the baby elephants and shit like that. So you apply that to human beings, and it kind of breaks down at some point. I mean, it directly contradicts Hume's law, which is, you can't derive an ought from an is. Just because nature and reality is a certain way, it doesn't mean it ought to be a certain way. So just because some people are stronger physically in terms of race, or more intellectual in terms of race, which is a big, no-no in today's world. We can't even talk about the differences between races in terms of our abilities, but there are nonetheless. Either way, this system of morality is the one that they stuck with, which is what allowed them to, like you said, justify this emotional imprint and how it was manifested, in the most horrible of ways. So again, like you said, it's an emotional thing. It's not, even though they based their initial idea in an intellectual manner, which is, well, I mean, it's a thing of nature. It's all about health and good things. It eventually broke down
Yeah.
their whole. Yeah.
Actually, a large part of where it started was with hippie communities, and they encouraged small communities living close to nature, vegetarianism, a lot of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was more communal. It had very little to do with
Yeah, like they
what it became.
Yeah, no, it was all about being healthy all the time. They had propaganda videos about exercise and stuff like that. I saw documentaries recently about that kind of stuff. But then they ran into the problems of how do you define health, and then how do you define what's good for the society, and that's why they ended up killing tens of thousands of invalids, people who had disabilities and stuff like that, and sterilizing people who were deemed not unfit to breed. So again, the morality of it breaks down because they were trying to create a superhuman race, which isn't natural. It goes against the very morality system that they were using to begin with. We should be healthy in nature. It's like, well, you're not really trying to be natural, are you? You're fucking with genetics, and So okay, that's just a good point to make in terms of how powerful this kind of unconscious emotional narrative can impact your intellectual capacity. So it's more of a technical problem with this paragraph. We should just make it a bit more clear.
Yeah.
So where does this leave us? In the present moment, of course, standing in a single blip in time, with a vast dark ocean of unknown stretching before us and behind us, and perhaps in every other direction as well. Very poetic. This is where it turns into the poetry, which is beautiful. I like that you brought in time, so that the idea that time is an essential component of all philosophies and how we navigate reality is something people don't think about at all. Mm-hmm. So you're introducing a major point when it comes to anything that has to do with morality is time itself. So I think that's self-explanatory. Let's move on to this bigger paragraph here. One might demand what the purpose of this may be, that the directions we must take are clear and provided by the world, that the hard truths of life are given to us by the savagery of nature and the will to pleasure and power, the avoidance of pain. We are small and fated to be crushed. Though I could never discount the evidence, I could never ask that we set it aside completely. I would have to ask where that has led us so far. It may well be that we live in a fatalistic world, but if we take this to its conclusion, it tends to undermine the more evolutionary, animalistic way of life most portray it to represent, and instead leave us staring into a deep, dark pit of dread, with no reason to survive other than to avoid death and seek brief moments of pleasure in any means possible. This does not account for the experiences of art or community, nor does it consider the sometimes esoteric yet valid observations in quantum physics, that scale, distance, time, and separation may be less substantial and objective than we may think. Okay, so there's a lot of ideas in this one.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because you're actually countering the previous thing that you were saying about, how what we were talking about was the whole nature, evolutionary humanism type morality system. And now you're actually making a case for why some of that is important.
There's a good case for it. There is a good case for it. Yeah. And I don't actually think it's wrong. I think it's incomplete. That's all. Or at least if we want to be reasonable, with all the evidence that's out there, it's incomplete. Yeah. It might be totally true, but
So I think to begin with, the paragraph that we're talking about, how our intellectual capacity is, I'm going to say what's his name? Elon Musk said about the limbic system. He said that the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of ourselves, the rational part of ourselves, it works for the limbic system. The limbic system is what we're trying to satisfy here. It's not that the prefrontal cortex tells the primitive reptilian brain of ours, what should be and what should happen. I mean, the evidence is contrary to that. We can see very clearly that everything that we're trying to do is to satisfy some kind of primitive urge. Therefore,
I will say that there's more to it than that, but that is a big part of it.
It's a general, yeah. So, in general, this emotional imprint, like you said, and how it drives what we say, what we do, and what we believe in, I think is a weakness for all systems of morality. We just discussed the one, evolutionary humanism, which is what we call in our philosophy moral naturalism. Right. So there are two other systems of morality in our philosophy, but again, we're talking about the foreword here, so we'll get to that later. But I think this weakness that we have, or this problem I think we should address, which is that we are emotionally driven, even in our most rational arguments. It undermines all systems of morality. And all systems of morality are perhaps incomplete because of this problem, right? Because we take them to their logical conclusions, whatever system we use, and when you do that, you're pushing it to an extreme. And as soon as you push anything to an extreme, it breaks things down and no longer works.
Yeah.
So,
exactly. I mean, for anything to work, it has to work as a whole system. If you take if you dissect an animal and take out its heart and start wondering why the heart's not working well without the rest of the body, it's because you just killed it. You just took it apart and was like, oh, this is the center of the being. Why isn't it working? Like, it's.
Yeah, I like it. It's a good. But here's the thing: in the same paragraph, you kind of jump to another idea entirely, but you're making a transition.
Yeah,
so you have to separate this paragraph because you're saying, after talking about how we undermine the more evolutionary animalistic way of life by leaving us kind of like in a dark pit of dread with no reason to survive, right? All that stuff. Then you say,
it gets a little complicated there.
This does not account for the experiences of art or community, nor does it consider the sometimes esoteric yet valid observations in quantum physics that scale, distance, time, and separation may be less substantial and objective than we may think. So I don't know how that's completely relevant. How is that?
It is kind of abstract. It is going back a few steps because I mean the evolutionary moral stance or evolutionary humanitarian. I don't want to use the word humanitarian, but yeah,
humanism.
You know what I mean? Humanism perspective is very reductionist, as in purely cause and effect. One thing happens and it's linear, right? And this comes back to what I was hinting at before with time, is that it's not necessarily just purely linear, because we experience it as back to front, past the future. Oh, 1 second, busy.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So it does get pretty high level, and I don't necessarily connect it well with the rest there.
Yeah, no, but I understand now. I understand the point that you're making. So if I can resume it, you're saying that well, I'm just reading it. So this whole paragraph is really still part of the previous paragraph. We should stick it with the previous paragraph. And then you're alluding to the fact that when it comes down to the fundamental structures of reality, which is quantum physics, that these things aren't as well. They prove that there's no objectivity. There's no way to make any sense of, or any kind of, there's no determinism to the fundamental building blocks of reality there, as far as
that's not the whole picture,
or that it's not exactly. So so I see why you're talking about that. You're saying that
it's the same reason why I wrote that essay a while ago about infinite regression.
Yeah.
That once we get to a certain point, we have to start accepting ideas that are less linear and direct than might have wanted to at first.
Yeah, I see it now. You wrote a really good phrase here. You said, it may well be that we live in a fatalistic world, but if we take it to its logical conclusion, it tends to undermine the more evolutionary animalistic way of life.
See, that's a pretty loaded sentence in itself.
Yeah, that's where you have to make things more clear, because you're saying if living in a determinist world, like that's fatalistic, if we take it to its conclusion, it does undermine the more kind of evolutionary animalistic way of life. And
it's funny because it's almost like a pyramid here. You take all the evidence, but you ignore most of it. You just look at the survival of the fittest, and then you're like, oh, it's all of evolutionary humanity. But it continues if you keep going that way and narrowing it down, just trying to distill it more and more, throwing out the rest of it, which is part of the whole picture. Then you get to what is obvious and tends to imprint itself the most on us, is that it's all kind of pointless, and it's all basically nihilism, and all you can do is just hope that you get your rocks off and die, not too painfully. It's meaningless. It
zaps all meaning and beauty and experience. That's why you say it doesn't account for the experiences of art and community. It doesn't consider the esoteric yet valid observations in quantum physics and so on and so forth. Okay,
and
very well said.
Also, if it was just a purely evolutionary world, I mean, I could give a bunch of examples, but coming from that perspective, then art, community, religion are all just delusions and mistakes, and we're mistakes because we destroy the environment that we're a part of, blah blah blah. But if it was a purely evolutionary existence, that wouldn't even be allowed to happen. And I mean, anyways, why would humans even exist? Bacteria survive way better than we do. Why would we have ever evolved past bacteria?
Yeah,
because there are other aspects in life that life reaches for. That's it.
No, it's very loaded, this whole topic.
Yeah, no, I know exactly.
You could make the argument that evolution is all about playing the numbers game, just like trying every single, and that's what it is. It's like a process of elimination, right? You try every single output that you can manifest, and then whatever works will go on to evolve, right? But anyway, let's move on. So here's the next paragraph, which is great because you're switching it up again. You're always, jumping from one foot to the other and keeping people,
It's a boxing match, man.
Yeah, they're on the ball. They're not able to really kind of sink in and say, this is the position that he has,
Well, I don't really have a position.
Exactly. So here's what it says. I'll take a different approach, replying instead from the emotional level rather than the intellectual, which is where the argument was framed from at first, but can never really be answered fully. We can fight forever on the cerebral plane, but we may get nowhere. And in truth, the fight is over the hearts of men, not their heads. Very prophetic. That's just an introduction to the next point. So I'll read the next point. I think I'm about to get hiccups, which would suck.
Yeah, you ate kind of fast there, right before we started. Yeah.
Oh no!
Okay, do the podcast with your arms up. It helps.
You think it's gonna work? Okay. Yes, coming from a place of limbic reactivity, having been beaten or sexually abused in youth, hearing nothing but the selfishness, manipulation, hypocrisy.
Okay, maybe don't read that with your arms up because that's a pretty heavy sentence.
It might have worked. Shit. Now I have to start it. It might have worked. Okay. Hold on.
All right.
Yes, coming from a place of limbic reactivity, having been beaten or sexually abused in youth, hearing nothing but the selfishness, manipulation, hypocrisy, and incoherence of one's environment growing up, learning nothing of value in the school system and listening to music that's all about superficial pleasure, feeling like eating shit and drinking shit.
That was supposed to be feeling like shit, eating.
Like shit eating. Yeah, but what does that mean? Feeling like shit eating.
Well, you feel like shit because you're eating.
Oh, feeling like
Yeah,
shit because you're
I
eating
think there's
and
a little
drinking.
typo there.
Yeah, you gotta add because. So feeling like shit because you're eating, drinking, breathing in toxic crap, then of course we're left emotionally incompatible to any sort of two-sided relationship to the unknown. How could we possibly consider that there is any form of awareness or order or justice behind it? It couldn't be anything else than a vast, cold, barren abyss. The mind, or specifically the reticular activating system in the brain, is then primed to only see the things that validate this view of the unknown. And there is little hope left deep inside for things to change.
Mhm.
Ooh, it's a tough one. What do
Yeah.
you have to say about that?
What do you have to say for yourself? Uh,
No.
well, yeah, I mean, a lot of us have had hard lives, so on some level, especially when we've been slighted, or how do I say, when our when it's really been personal, like our family has screwed us over, or we've seen the people who are close to us end up not really making much sense, or doing things that you thought were below them,
Yeah, I understand.
stuff like that.
You've
It
enumerated,
gets to us.
sorry,
Hmm?
you've enumerated a lot of shitty things that shape us, right? And,
Yeah.
and there's a limbic reactivity, right? We react in certain ways because of all those shitty things. And that's what leaves us emotionally incompatible to having any sort of two-sided
Yes.
relationship to the unknown. Now, what do you mean by that? What is the two-sided relationship to the unknown?
Right. Because it feels like we're getting rammed against a wall in terms of what life is.
Mm-hmm.
It's instead of it becoming something where there's some kind of interaction,
Mm-hmm.
where that life might have some kind of responsiveness to you, to how you act, to how you feel, any kind of biofeedback, I could almost compare it to.
Yeah.
That idea, you can't possibly consider that, even if you're on the surface a religious person.
Mm.
Emotionally, it doesn't make sense to you.
You're left thinking that you're just a particle floating around and just being
Yeah,
determined by the winds of life. And so you don't
nothing
consider
cares about you.
yourself as having any kind of impact on the winds, if I continue the metaphor. No,
Yeah.
you have no, because of all this negative shit that's been happening to you.
Pretty
Okay.
much.
So
Yeah, it's pretty simple, really.
that is largely unknown, that fact.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. So then it says, how could we possibly consider that there's any form of awareness or order or justice behind it? Okay, so this is why people don't even maybe get to the point where they could start thinking about, hey, maybe there's a pattern or a clear kind of order that we could extrapolate from reality, because I have the power to do so, right? Which is what you and I have been doing, is creating this kind of philosophy, which is to find an awareness or a higher awareness or perspective of life, or what lies behind life.
Yeah. What are the fundamental, both physical and metaphysical,
Exactly.
recurring themes,
I'm
or like
really hoping,
axiomatic points?
yeah, I'm really hoping that this is, whoever's listening to this gets kind of excited to be like, what the hell did they figure out? Like, what are they, what's this philosophy about if they feel like they've gone beyond the unknown there? And then you cap off the paragraph by saying that it couldn't be anything else than a vast, cold, barren abyss, which is, so basically it's what the person is thinking to themselves generally in life. They're like, well, it's dark, and the mind is primed to only see this sort of view that the unknown is hopeless. There's nothing to look at.
That there is nothing in the unknown.
Yes, it's just unknown. Exactly.
And that's what I think is also behind a large part of our culture's pathological arrogance. This idea that we know things, and that's the way things are, and that we can say that
Yeah,
with
that
any
we
kind of
know.
actual validity.
Yeah, that we know that certain things are unknown, and it's like, well, have you actually tried to know them?
Yeah.
Begin with, maybe.
Yeah. Personally, have you actually gone out and tried that?
Yeah.
Because it's also kind of like this assumption that there's no land left to discover. There's nothing left to explore. Science has covered it all. Everything is sterile and fully observed at this point. It's funny because that's never been really said, but we all kind of feel that now in our culture.
We de facto live that way. We live by that kind of mentality.
And the reason for that is because we just assume that the unknown is empty.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's it.
Very well said. Very well said. So then we have the next one where you say, yes, many suffer, and I genuinely tear up a little sometimes just thinking of that in passing, knowing how much pain I've experienced and how much so many have as well. But from a merely statistical point of view, this is absolutely not a valid data set to build our conclusions off of. Conclusions, I should say. Anecdotal evidence is not evidence. Yet, when it is imprinted on the subconscious of most, it's likely to skew the picture even in scientific communities. Oh my God, my fucking mind is mind blown. You know why? Because you're stitching things together so well. It's so well integrated. Because here you're saying anecdotal evidence is not evidence, yet when it is imprinted on the subconscious of most, which is what we're talking about, we're talking about emotional imprint. So you have a syllogism here. You have a syllogism going, which is, for people who don't know what that means, a syllogism is the way you construct an argument. Is you have two premises, and then, or a number of premises, could be 4, 5, 6, and then a conclusion. And because of those premises and their specific order, your conclusion is deemed correct or incorrect. So your premises have to be backed up by evidence, and so yeah. So basically, you have this string here. This whole foreword is very well stitched together, because we already talked about how we come from an emotional, reactive kind of mind. Then we talked about how that leads us to talk or to think about the unknown in a negative way, and that we live in a nihilistic kind of manner because of it. And so, that leads to suffering. And now you're saying none of that makes it valid. Just because you're in that situation, there's nothing about that makes our conclusions valid. You can't use the evidence of this experience. Oh my God, this is everything that I just described. This is the way it is. That's anecdotal evidence. That's just your experience of life so far.
It's subjective, and you can say the objective, like all objective conclusions that we make over time are based off of anecdotal, subjective experience of people, even doing scientific studies. Yes, I agree. It's not completely invalid, but statistically, when we do science, that's not accepted. That is not the standard of determining if something is completely true or not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then you enumerate these kind of like mantras that we kind of repeat. Everybody knows. It's obvious that's the way things are. These are not valid arguments. Those are, again, assumptions. Again, I'm not saying that the more postmodern or nihilistic view of the world is wrong. I'm simply saying that from a scientific standpoint, it is not as valid as we may be led to believe, observing our world. Then you go on to say, of course, this leads to a more utilitarian perspective on worldviews, being somewhat forced to give up on a tight hold most of us like to have on our stance.
I'd like to clarify that a bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe. Because basically what I'm saying is that, the most seemingly obvious worldview that we can have ends up not actually being that valid or more substantiated than any other. So if we can't know, then we have to employ worldviews anyways, just in a practical sense, to be able to function, right?
You need utility. You need utility.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we need worldviews to live.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It's intrinsic to how we function. Absolutely.
Yeah, to making decisions or anything.
Yeah. So, but the utilitarian perspective, if you take the scientific, so what you're saying is if you use this scientific standpoint, which makes your assumptions invalid, well, it leads to a utilitarian perspective on worldviews in general that forces you to give up on this tight hold to the idea that everything,
any of them.
yeah, we know everything and there's no need to like look further, but yet you keep suffering because you are living blindly to what is unknown.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. Okay, very, very well cleared up.
I do think I could maybe say that better in the actual sentence.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're taking notes. Take some notes while I'm doing this.
Yeah, I should be.
Yeah, maybe in the next one. You'll probably remember some of this stuff when you revise the text.
We can always look back on it. Always.
Well then, well, yeah, you just gotta listen to this video.
Yeah.
Well then, you might say, even if it's all filtered through emotion and subjectivity, and it makes the materialist, reductionist perspective less valid, it does not completely invalidate it. It remains what I and so many have experienced, and what we see in nature and the universe. And I agree with that. I do not plan on discounting the view, merely taking it a few I am merely taking it a few notches down from ultimate superiority in terms of preferred metaphysical worldviews. Okay. So that's I think self-explanatory, very well said. Then you say, I regularly consider the point of view and have done the emotional work necessary to, often enough not to be attached to it. Okay. So you've done the emotional work necessary to often enough not be attached to it. I get it.
Yeah, and all that really involves is being aware of it day to day over a period of time, realizing how it affects you and realizing that it's like if you actually stop acting from that place, your life doesn't get any worse.
Okay. All right.
You know? It actually, in my experience, gets better, and those who have helped, it seems to improve their lives.
I believe the same. Mm-hmm. We know what adverse childhood experience, or the ACE test, scores correlate with. We know that trauma leads to addiction and dysfunctional behavior. Maybe that's how we should all be living, if it really is all pointless. Just live fast and die young. It makes sense coming from the perspective of there being little more to this life than what meets the eye. But still, there are many who have lower ACE scores, less trauma, who live lives that they can enjoy, that they love, and find purpose and satisfaction in contributing to the world, to being moral in some way, shape, or form, and seeing the beauty in things. I'm not trying to prove or disprove a worldview. I'm not trying to convince a following of a certain perspective on how things work. Very simply, you can say, how can there be a God? How can there be goodness with all the pain and suffering there is in this world? But really, who are we to say what is best? With the limitations to our ability to know, to sense, how are we supposed to tell a potentially infinitely perfect, omniscient intelligence how to orchestrate things? The very perspective that we are small and limited sacks of flesh that work like machines and have flawed perception circles back to invalidating the idea that we are fit at all to decide what is best, or what is real at all anyways. How are we supposed to have it? Oh yeah, we can stop there. I think you're doing a good job of basically reminding the reader that there's no argument for any one worldview here. You're just talking about components and how they all collapse.
And how often, if you take one perspective, it tends to circle back and disprove itself.
Mm-hmm.
That happens again and again.
Paradoxical.
Yeah.
Then you say, how are we supposed to have a coherent view if it's all just brain chemicals selecting whatever information best validates our limbic system's self-conception and survival? It's a mouthful.
Here. Yeah. I mean,
are we totally...
I tend to pack these sentences in as much as I can.
Yeah, that one we should maybe just elongate a little bit more. But you knock it out with a fucking punch. It really is well ended.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to say that a second time so that we can really understand the sense of it. How are we supposed to have a coherent view if it's all just brain chemicals selecting whatever information best validates our limbic system's self-conception and survival? Are we totally focused on the suffering that we ignore the positives. As the news says, if it bleeds, it leads. And that was like brilliant. When I heard that, I was like, crazy, just prophetic, very prophetic. So
basically,
what do you mean by the limbic system self-conception?
That's the ego. That's in the most biological terms that we can talk about. What our ego actually is the limbic system has a kind of reality map. It has, we've talked about this before in other podcasts, but it has an image of what the world is and who you are, what your role in it is, what you can do in it, blah, blah, blah. And basically, if the limbic system's reality map, which is what it uses to navigate and survive, right? And create priorities and hierarchies of value. If that gets challenged, it reacts. That's what an emotional reaction, that's what, the word getting triggered. That's like why is it so popular nowadays? Because all of these worldviews are suddenly clashing and creating so much obvious incoherence in the way that we see things that we get triggered. We get emotionally upset. Because on some level, our very ability to survive, our very ability to know who we are, is being challenged.
Yeah, it's reactionary to the max. The limbic system fires off without any kind of conscious control.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a survival mechanism. It wants you to strike out and hit something right now.
Yeah.
And basically its role in nature is if a lion is about to fucking eat you, meaning that's the biggest challenge to your self-conception that possibly can exist. And you fucking run. You get out of there. That's the trigger. So
in a nutshell, our abstract, super kind of like theoretical ideas and
they're extensions of our ego.
Yes, like they trigger our primitive things.
Yep.
Because like it's not like if you walk into, say, Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and say, "Oh, God doesn't exist," that's retarded, right? You get this really big reaction.
Imagining a guy just walks in.
Yeah, exactly. Just barrels in like, "Oh, Allah, fuck that guy,"
Yeah.
That's so reactionary, and it's like, well, why do you get this primitive reaction to kill someone for an idea that's just more abstract?
And I want to say, in that case too, our values and morals and our sense of being virtuous are very important in this sense too, because our morals, what are those about? It's about how we should best act in the world, meaning how we should act to get the best results, and how we should act to survive and live as well as possible.
Yeah,
you have to extend it that far.
Because we're social creatures. If we were like lone wolf type species where you live on your own all the time, that wouldn't be an issue. But because morality is what dictates, how we can survive, literally. If I share, people have this misconception about alpha males in nature and in humans. Alpha males are not the most tyrannical. In fact, the most tyrannical males in any society, in terms of at least chimps and stuff and what we've observed, they actually get like knocked the fuck out. Like the other males will band together and take that guy down. So an alpha male is not the most tyrannical or aggressive male in the society. And the reason for that is because we are social animals. We know that if you share, if you're less aggressive, if you're less selfish, then we can survive together. And this is why humans have taken over the planet. So yes, you're absolutely right. Morality ties into that in a big way. It's
also, if you believe in religion, if you think that God exists or Allah exists and God decrees a certain moral code, then okay, good, whatever, that's fine. But then you have to live by that to be able to go to heaven or to have eternal life and not be punished, go to hell, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Meaning, again, if that worldview is challenged, then that means someone is coming and challenging your idea of your chances of going to heaven or
Yeah. Well, it's survival. Your
experiencing
survival.
eternal,
It's your eternal survival. Yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah.
And if I think on another more subtle basis, it's also risking that everybody around you might be proselytized or convinced that your worldview doesn't work. And if your worldview doesn't work, what does work? That leaves you with your dick in your hand, like, oh my God, you know.
It's,
this is why,
once again, we get triggered by the unknown. We
yeah,
always get triggered by this fact that at the end of the day, we're faced with this terrifying thing.
exactly.
Which isn't that terrifying once you start to figure out how to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so that's very well expanded on. Then we're almost done here. Then it says, we have a habit of seeing the dark side of life, coming from a survivalist mindset. We were just talking about it, and rarely pick up on all the good that is around us. Is that an inherent state or a fallen state of sorts? Can fish tell that they're in water when it's all they've ever known? And besides, most people would never give up their subjective free will in exchange for any sort of promised paradise. This could lead to a discussion on determinism and free will, but I'll leave that here for now. So I want to talk about this. Because the first time I read it, I didn't know if I really agreed. I don't get the sense of this. Most people would never give up their subjective free will in exchange for any sort of promised paradise. I think that's exactly what religious people do, isn't it? They're like, okay, it's all God, it's all in God's hands. He determines my life.
That's the funny thing, because they never get down to the well, some believe in compatibilism, which is a whole other topic, but a lot of the time there is very little discussion of the inherent conflict between the idea of God deciding everything you do and you having free will. In most religions, you have both.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Because on the other hand, you do have this big push from Christianity who says, no, God gives you free will, and this is why people do evil and stuff. Like, that's how they justify the fact that God created a world that was evil. It's like, well, why did he do that to begin with? He's like, well, he didn't. He just gave us free will, and some people use that will to do evil. So, yeah, you have to have this compatibilism. Now, is compatibilism a cognitive dissonance of some sort, or is it a paradox of some sort?
Exactly. It depends how once we get into the details, it can be one or the other.
Yeah. Exactly. So,
and I don't think it's wrong necessarily. I think that the argument that God gave us free will and that's why there is evil is actually a decent argument. Not to say that it's right or wrong, but it's
but it's a decent argument until you use reductio ad absurdum on it, which is, well, if he created us with free will, which is a good thing, right? And that justifies the evil. Well, why create us in a situation where that was necessary to begin with, right? So it breaks down. It does break down. But if you take God out of this picture and you look at free will, from a, let's say, scientific atheist standpoint, there's still problems with it when you're looking at compatibilism. Some compatibilists, there's like two veins. I think there's some who really do use it in the cognitive dissonance type way or paradoxical way, and then others
just is, right?
And the others, which would be more of like the practical way. Like, they know there's no free will inherently. Like, they know that everything is deterministic, but from the standpoint, from our subjective experience, it's not practical to not believe in free will. We still believe in free will, insofar as it is practical for us to believe in free will.
And on the scale that we experience life, coming from our brains, it feels like free will. So
yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I think it's paradoxical in nature. Then you say
that's again another discussion: determinism and free will.
Yeah. Well, this whole philosophy is going to be expanding on all this stuff so that people really understand this very clearly. Because we could probably write a pamphlet, a novella, or something like that. But with all these terms, I think most people it would take a long time for them to understand. Because we don't want people to just understand. We want them to I mean, we want to understand, but we want to understand that we don't want them to understand in the sense that they have to believe in this. We want them to understand that there is no basis for the need to believe or to disbelieve. It's not relevant. It's paradoxical.
Yeah, exactly.
And that can bring you to a higher state of mind wherein you can be truly objective about all of these kind of things that we debate nowadays, this binary head-to-head clashing of it's socialism or capitalism, or it's left and right, or it's, you know, this or that, this or that.
And I think that's what's funny and might be confusing about the way that we talk, is that over and over again, we make arguments for, then against religion, for, then against science, for and against everything. And that's pretty much, that's the whole point.
That's the whole point, is it's that, you know, we're drawing a spectrum between two things and saying, look, there's a spectrum, and you're just choosing to be on one side or the other, right? With varying degrees as to where you are on the spectrum. Whereas paradoxism is all about recognizing that this is the spectrum that is inherently paradoxical to begin with, and that you don't realize, and then that's not necessarily something that we can't use with utility. And anyway, it goes further and further. So that'll be for when we start writing the book. We'll explain more, but maybe it's a nice little taste. So then you say, all to say, how will you choose to live your life? Of course, you can't go the complete opposite direction and start trusting everyone always. Or maybe you can, who knows? You can't really know without trying.
That's in brackets.
Yes, in brackets. Especially being that even if you feel that life is giving and or somewhat conscious and compassionate in some way or another, it doesn't mean everybody else does too. And they may try to take advantage of your trust. Just a consideration in case someone takes my breaking down of the materialist reductionist view more strongly than I meant it and runs the opposite direction. So this is alluding to everything we just said, literally. It's paradoxical. How are you going to choose your life? You can't go the complete opposite direction from what you know now. It's not what we're saying, right? You can't.
Not at all. And some people are they're impulsive romanticists at heart, or idealists. So they'll hear what I just said and be like, oh, damn, that's actually a decent argument against this despair that I feel all the time. And they'll go like some bipolar freak to the opposite extreme and not lock their bike up or lock their door and be like, oh, that fucking, I like Bob Marley, that I can't do that, otherwise I'm insulting God and telling him I don't trust him. Shit like that. I know a guy who did that. I know a guy who did specifically that, and he lost his bike, got a bunch of shit stolen, and
he blamed you.
And then he was all pissed off and like started getting angry at everybody. And I was like, well, that's not very compassionate. And he got so pissed at me. Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh, you're too much. You're too much. All right.
But this is what people do. These are the patterns that we fall into, and we see it again and again. You probably find this funny because you've probably seen similar shit.
I have, but not too often.
Yeah.
But it's funny when it happens. Speaking of bikes, if we're taking a little pause here in terms of Berlin and Germany in general is incredibly bike friendly. But here's the funny thing that
Montreal isn't.
Yeah, well, it is in Canada, in terms of Canada. But here's a good example of this whole contradiction and paradox, bad paradoxes, right? Nobody can tell me that, or tell each other, that there's no sense in grouping together these kinds of people. And this is what I mean by these kinds of people. Someone who rides their bike for environmental reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'll push for more bike lanes to be created and so on in the cities, right? And then this leads to, ironically, trees being cut down in the city, right? So there's a contradictory nature between what people do and then what people want, and I think this kind of hypocrisy stems from that. Because in London, there's this. Apparently, I had seen this clip, and it was some pundit or some political commentator who was talking about how they wanted to, the people who wanted to ride their bikes in the city for environmental reasons wanted to establish more roads, and they were about to cut like one of the oldest trees in London just to be able to establish these bike paths.
Right.
It's kind of strange. Anyway, Germany is already, when they built things, even back after the World War II, I think when they started constructing things and rebuilding, they had this stuff in mind anyway. So there are many trees, and it's very green, and there's like a shit ton of space for bike lanes and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything I'd like to get across with this kind of stuff, is every topic is so incredibly nuanced that you should never assume that you know what's going on. Yeah. Like, I know that stops us from taking action, and we are, throughout this process, we do plan on addressing that issue and actually putting in a logical way to work with uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
But like, exactly with these, for example, environmental issues, there's a lot nowadays, in our opinion, of very superficial perspectives on the issues, and which actually end up doing as much or more harm than good.
Yeah.
It's just an example, and we could be wrong, but what we're trying to do is that we're constantly, we're constant truth seekers. I believe that life rewards those who never stop searching for truth and never stop trying to improve and take more responsibility for themselves. Basically, what we're saying is, the more we've learned, the more nuance it gets, and the better the actions that we have taken have paid off.
Mm-hmm.
They've been more balanced, more targeted.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you've just resumed,
refined.
Yes, you've resumed 2 points that Jordan Peterson, he's a genius, has said in some of the podcasts that I listened to recently, is that one, the best advice you can really give to anybody at any time is just tell the truth. The truth is ultimately, and that's not a new idea. I mean, there's a reason for why on the American dollar bill it says, it's not. Yeah, I think it alludes to truth in some case. In some, I don't know, because it's in God we trust, but ultimately the religion of Christianity is also about truth. So I'm the truth, the way, the light, So anyway, we build our foundations on the notion of truth. But ironically, religions have a lot of, things that aren't true. So it undermines the fact that their highest ideal is truth, undermines their entire religion. And that's why, Christianity has died in the last couple hundred years. That's why Nietzsche predicted the death of God. But anyway, you're absolutely right when it comes to this truth thing, and then also how being more refined in the decisions that you make and the actions that you take, there needs to be a target, right? You need to aim at something. I mean, people are so, I don't know what to do with my life, I don't feel like there's enough, impact.
Because you can see from a person's general state that the actions that they end up taking often are the same across the board. For like, if you take 20 people who generally say, I don't know what's going on, then you look at how they live their lives, it's often very similar. And then if you look at people who are extremely efficient and probably people that you don't even talk to because they're so busy actually working and researching and figuring things out, and you look at what they do, often it's kind of similar. Maybe different, but you see what I mean. As in, if you feel lost, then usually you're going to, you're going to see signs in the street. You're going to see what's on your Facebook feed, which is what most people see. It's what most people are given on a silver platter, which is the most simplistic, marketed thing. So then everyone all the people who are confused and lost end up, unfortunately, doing the most simplistic, marketed thing.
Let me ground what you're saying in an example. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of people who believe in saving the environment, right? And you know, the fact that they just accept at face value the simplistic measures that are put forward to save the environment, like, for example, you know, we need to start planting trees, right? And we need to use solar power. Okay, great. But trees takes 10 to 15, 20 years to really grow and you know, start sucking carbon out of it. We don't have the time for that. Because I had an argument recently with a guy who was like, you know, there's some tech giants who are creating these carbon sucking machines. And it's like, well, why use the machines? We have the technology already. It's called a tree. It's like, dude, it's so oversimplified. Have you thought about how we don't have the time for it, and why can't we do both? There's no, you know.
Yeah. There's some truth to what he says, but
there's some truth to what it says, but it's ridiculous to use that oversimplified argument to negate the good that we're doing with technology. But because the tech companies are being seen as like this evil, dark overlords because they're taking in all the wealth and all the control over things.
Which is it has both truth and falsity to it.
Exactly. It has, everything is paradoxical. There's truth and falsity to everything. But it doesn't mean that we should not use the powers of good for these that these technologies can bring, just because there's a risk that someone's going to use that technology or that power to be corrupt with. It's been join the party. It's been happening since the beginning of time. Technology has always had this problem. Anyway.
By the way, I just want to plug everyone look up Alan Savory. Prairie lands are a bigger carbon sink than trees.
Prairie?
I just want to say that. Yeah. Prairie lands supported by cows that shit. That's pretty much what I'm going to say. I'm just going to... Yeah. Everyone look at Alan Savory's TED Talk.
Oh, Alan Savory. Okay, cool. Yeah. Let's finish this up there. Okay, so you're saying, I'm not asking people to live in denial and believe that everything is okay all the time, but do consider the fact that hope, sustained and acted upon, so often makes our lives more satisfactory, and what that might mean about life. Consider that there may be far, far more to it all than what is immediately evident or what seems likely to you and those around you. Really, when you realize how little you and everybody else knows, how much we can know, there's a whole lot of room for plenty of strange things. You can live by the status quo or do what most people are doing, or the most authoritative seeming people tell you is most likely to be true or best. Or you can be a social pariah and make up your own world. Or you can find a middle ground and stay open. Always leave a little room for testing and experimenting with new theories or ideas of what our relationship to the unknown is all about. And that's the end of your foreword, dude.
Yeah.
I mean, self-explanatory again.
Yeah.
It was immediately considering it before forward and all that. Yeah, it's...
we're all about that middle path, that Buddhist middle path, the third option, the third way.
Yeah. I'm excited to present it to the world, really. I think it's been a long time coming, and it's still a ways off. I mean, it's been 2 years that we've developed this, but now we need to write the book. So that's what we're doing.
It's funny because in many ways what we're saying isn't new at all. It's just we're trying to systematize in a way, in a very loose way, how people can actually employ this to everything.
Yeah, well, we're grounding. So basically, like Yuval Harari said, I think Yuval Harari has done wonders for this world. He's one of the keys to the future. I mean, I think most sane people or logical people, after knowing a few key pieces of information, would really all agree that humanity is on its way out. Whether we look at it from one perspective or another, humanity as we know it. I'm not saying it's the existential end of humanity. It's just that what we are becoming will be very different. Are you really human if you fuck with your genetics a little bit, right? That changes how you act. I mean, are we human now? I mean, the fact that you have all of the world's information, in your mind, not really directly in your mind, but you have it in the palm of your hand. It's still kind of like a new piece of brain. It's just on your hand that's been added to you. We have incredible amount of information going in. We know so much more than someone who could study their entire lives would have known 200 years ago. So we're becoming something that's not really human anymore. We're starting to see the growing pains of that. And so what you and I are doing, or what Yuval Harari is a key piece of information in what he's contributed in his books, is to show the world that religions, and in fact everything that humans do, is all about storytelling. Telling a story is how we codify how to navigate reality, right? And this is why you can look at Jordan Peterson's lectures on Disney movies and all the other popular franchises out there, like Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, you know, so on and so forth, that there's a reason for why these stories are popular. It's because they're ancient. The main skeleton of all these stories all tell the same story, and it's a story that has to do with how to navigate reality. It's what made us human. So Yuval Harari was good in pointing that out. However, he doesn't really put forward a new story, right? Like he says, you know, religion is like a software, and it's like software from way back in the day, but the technology and our reality of the situation is changing so drastically that we need a new story. Now, religion died off. Then the new religion became liberalism, right? Capitalism. The voter knows best. You know, the customer.
Individualism.
Exactly, individualism. Follow your heart. You know, do what you love. This became the new God, the new story that we can use to navigate reality. But now that's dying off very quickly because of these new technologies. Algorithms know us better than we know ourselves, and they'll continue to.
Also, it's not really serving us anymore. It's reached its conclusion, which is what we talked about, the nihilism in a sense.
Exactly. So
a disconnect from life. Yeah.
Exactly. We're being squeezed from that side of things, and then we're also being squeezed from the future side, which is that we won't even know ourselves better than we do. It'll be something else that knows us. And then we're connecting into this hive-mindedness with other people, so we don't even realizing it, so we're losing our individuality. So all of this needs a new story. You know, it needs a new encompassing software, a new story to be able to help people navigate this transition or this evolution, if you will. And I think this is a good way to conclude this sort of speech, this talk, and this.
I'll just say, the new story that we're going to offer isn't just a new story that will become old and cause more problems down the line. It in itself, the story teaches how to create a new story.
Yes.
For as things develop. Yeah.
Absolutely, it does. The paradoxism, this story or religion or whatever you want to call it, this new framework or philosophy, let's call it a philosophy. It's a story that tells you how you can create your own story. You know, and ultimately,
without being diluted.
Exactly, it's to always search for the truth, how to connect to the only one story, which is the unknown. So if everybody is doing the same thing, then ultimately, just like any other story, it's like if everybody's Buddhist and they agree on that, there's peace. But if there's like a Shinto or another type of religion, then they kind of clash, right? Same thing with Islam and Christianity and Judaism. This push for a homogeneous system has always been an issue, right? We clash with other systems. However, it's not to say that it doesn't work. You know, within the Arab world, it's homogeneous.
Some friction can actually be a good thing. Yeah. It's just often it tends to go too far because.
Exactly.
Anyways, for many reasons.
Yeah. So what would it look like if all of humanity had shared the same story? That's what every religious person or everybody with their desire to change the world thinks that it would be great. Whether you're
most science-minded people believe that too. They wish everyone believed in science or understood science.
It doesn't matter what worldview we have, whatever worldview we have, we think everything would be better if we all agreed on one story. Well, you know, eventually, because we keep growing and you know, expanding, well, not everybody agrees with the story and all those kinds of things. So that's one of the major problems. But I think this paradoxism philosophy bypasses this problem because we're not teaching a story. What we're doing is I think establishing a fundamental basis for truth, which is what can be known about reality, and how to erect a framework that allows you to be flexible enough
Yeah, that's the main thing.
to adapt to reality as it occurs, and yet still have a framework for living life, for feeling like you have purpose and meaning. And so it's almost like the perfect pie, you know. It's not too hot, not too cold. It's just like just right, the Goldilocks zone type shit.
It's the kind of thing where you could live in a box your entire life, and then you see a sphere, and everyone's told you spheres can't exist, they're very unlikely, blah blah blah. And instead of being like, what the fuck, and losing your mind and saying that it was probably just a dream, a delusion, basically the flatland story, if anyone knows that. And paradoxism would allow you to be like, huh. See what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's like you said, it's a continuous striving for truth, while realizing that truth is in itself a struggle, a journey. It's never a conclusion.
I think there's a South African saying that's speak softly but carry a big stick. So it's kind of like, it's being open, it's being fully open all the time, but at the same time being able to be discerning and allow yourself to refine and prioritize. Even if there is no right way or wrong way, you can still just, how do I say it? Decide.
Yeah, you can still
Go
have
for it.
you can still have make a decision. It's just a well-informed decision. You're being conscious, right? It's kind of like what the Buddhists do, is being aware of what you're doing, regardless of the decision you're taking.
I guess that's a huge part of it as well. It's just
the
more awareness you can develop, the better.
Another way we can describe it is just we're merging Eastern philosophy with Western, religious Judeo-Christian values. We're merging these two, right?
It's funny because we keep trying to explain it in different ways, using different forms of duality, and explaining the way that you can connect two seeming opposites.
Yeah,
it's all the same thing, what we're saying.
Yeah, we're living the paradox. We've integrated it in how we live our lives. This is why it's a recurring theme for us. It'll always be that way. It's infinite. But I think most people don't realize that, the Western world came up with their religions, and those religions had the impacts that they did because they ran off of an objective truth. Right? They said, God exists. This is what he says about morality and purpose. Now let's use that to the maximum utility, and that's why they took over a lot of the world, and they colonized. It's one of the reasons why they colonized a lot of the world. In the East, they've achieved enlightenment and nirvana and individual peace and well-being because they believe in a more paradoxical view, like what you and I are talking about of reality. It's neither an objective source of truth nor a relativistic source of truth and morality. It's rather within, right? It's almost like a nothingness. It's a negation of all those things. Whereas what you and I are doing, I think, is connecting that and that. We're trying to, because you can't really create a system of morality. I mean, it still doesn't tell you what you should do in certain situations to just be a Buddhist. I mean, Buddhism doesn't tell you anything about whether we should be able to abort something or not, a baby or not.
There are sects. There's again, there's so many different views even within Buddhism and Christianity.
But some could just say, well, it's the person who's having the abortion, But
I mean, we're giving very broad strokes to this, but I fully agree.
So I think it was a pretty good little session there.
Yeah. God, I hate it. There's at least 2 or 3 times I've had an idea that I felt was like, oh yeah, this is a great way to go next, and I forget it next second. But yeah, I'll write it down if I remember.
Yeah, please do. I have some writing to do then for our next talk. I'm going to
Yep.
stop this right now. Peace, everybody. Oh, by the way, if you reach the end of this, and I should mention it next time in the first part of the in the next episode, but I'm going to put the piece that we just broke down in the description on YouTube, so that someone can just take a look at the text or whatever.
Mm-hmm. The whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
Cool.